Okay, looks like it's live. Here with Kevin, of course. It's on his channel, Kevin Castley, and Keith Knight. They are coming from two different political perspectives. They're going to have a debate. Obviously, Kevin's a neocon. I believe Keith is a libertarian. Is that correct? Or okay. And then so that's going to be kind of a broad debate. We're going to start off with 15-minute opening statements. And I guess if you want to take it away, Keith, and introduce yourself and everything.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for having me on. My name's Keith Knight. I run the Don't Tread on Anyone YouTube channel and Odyssey channel. I'm also a contributor to the Libertarian Institute. I'll just go into my 15 minutes here. The primary disagreement between libertarians and neoconservatives comes in the form of foreign policy understanding. Generally, the war on terror against al-Qaeda since 2001 has consisted of not taking the Taliban's offer to hand over bin Laden, Zarqawi giving us al-Qaeda in Iraq after the U.S. overthrew Saddam, which there was no Iraq beforehand, the U.S. siding with al-Qaeda in Libya against Gaddafi, an organization known as LIFG, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. Muammar Gaddafi was the first person on earth to put out an arrest warrant for Osama bin Laden in 1996. It also has involved the U.S. siding with al-Qaeda in Syria against Assad. This is according to an email by Jake Sullivan. This is one of the Hillary Clinton emails where he says, AQ is on our side in Syria, siding with al-Qaeda and al-Nusra to overthrow Assad. Of course, they are also siding with al-Qaeda in Yemen until recently against the current rebel government in Yemen. It's also cost hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths. Millions of people have been displaced since the war on terror. Can you imagine if what happened in Iraq and Syria and all these other places the U.S. is bombing, if it happened in New York or Los Angeles or Nebraska? If it's wrong to do in this geographical area called Nebraska, it's wrong to do in this geographical area called Iraq. We have thousands of drones and bombings which have destroyed homes, architecture, and businesses. We have thousands of U.S. veteran suicides because of the post-traumatic stress disorder that occurs in a time of war. We've had about 4,500 military combat deaths. Thousands have been permanently injured, not to mention mental injuries along with post-traumatic stress, as I previously mentioned. We've spent trillions of dollars and are not safer as a causal result. And there today are tens of thousands of al-Qaeda members in more countries than there were in 2001, according to the Central Intelligence Agency. In 2001, there were about 400 al-Qaeda members. Today, across multiple continents, there are tens of thousands. The reason this was stated in one of Osama bin Laden's letters, actually a number of them. The first one was an open letter to King Fahd in August of 1995. In his second letter, a declaration of jihad against America's occupying the land of the two sacred mosques. His Declaration of World Islamic Front for Jihad Against Jews and Crusaders of 1998, and a warning to the United States in October of 2001. He primarily focused on the Qana massacre of 1996 by the Israelis, occupying Mecca and Medina with U.S. military soldiers, and Iraqi sanctions imposed by Father George Bush in 1991, which killed anywhere between 100 and 300,000 civilians. Bin Laden says it's 1.5 million, obviously a lie. We also have statements by 3 of the 9/11 hijackers, according to researcher Robert Pape at the University of Chicago. What is happening in Muslim countries today? Blatant occupation about which there is no doubt. There is no duty more obligatory after faith than to repel them. 2, repelling the Americans, occupying the land of the two sanctuaries is the most obligatory of obligations. Number 3, and I say to America, if it wants its armies and people to be safe, then it must withdraw all of its forces from Muslim lands and depart from all our countries. If you saw the way the left flipped out about Russian interference in 2016, imagine if Russia had stations in America and was directing U.S. economic and domestic policy. Of course, the war in Afghanistan had nothing to do with 9/11. It was actually a military operation planned on September 4th, 2001, according to Donald Rumsfeld in his own testimony on Congress, at Congress, rather. On March 23rd, 2004, he mentioned National Security Presidential Directive 9, which was the plan to have a regime change in Afghanistan. Now, the criteria for a just war, this is not to say war is never justified just because we oppose the state's war. Just as we oppose state education doesn't mean we're against education. Sometimes war is justified. We just have the same criteria for me helping an old lady getting mugged that we do me helping a group of people getting mugged, and if that group of people is far away in a foreign country. General principles are we only retaliate against the aggressors. The war is to be funded voluntarily. If you don't want to chip in, if you think it's a wrong thing to do, you don't have to fund the operation, and people have to join voluntarily. You have no right to draft or enslave other people. As far as if we want to care about national security, we want to make sure that we do not have a government. We want to embrace the principles of libertarianism. If a country invades and there is a government there, well, people are just looking for a ruling class to obey. If there is no ruling class and we have embraced the principles of self-ownership and non-aggression, they would have to go around and enslave each person individually. It would be a totally armed society. They'd recognize no right to rule, and you more or less would not be able to do it. Libertarianism is basically a philosophy that says human beings own their own bodies. With regard to others, they have a better claim to their own bodies because only they can directly control their own bodies. You can only indirectly control someone else's body by first directly controlling yours. Now, what does this have to do with government? What makes government a unique institution is not schools or roads or anything like that. It claims the right to initiate aggression against peaceful people. That is more or less what Franz Oppenheimer, the sociologist, made the point of in his book, The State. My proof that neoconservatism is actually incorrect is, one, it has a double standard for this group of people called the Congress group or the government group or the police group or the military group. They're just different groups of human beings that have no more rights than anyone else. It says that government has the right to tax, but no one else has the right to issue taxes. Only this group. Blatant double standard. This group has the right to regulate, which is a euphemism for violently dominating peaceful people. It says slavery is bad unless this group enslaves, and we call it the draft. Another blatant double standard. You have to be consistent in your scientific method. You have to be consistent in your philosophical method. It grants the state the right to kidnap. It grants the state the right to make laws. So arresting someone for murder and stopping them, all of us have it, but the state is a different organization. By writing words down on paper, it has the right to initiate violence against peaceful people. The libertarian says this is inherently immoral, and of course, the states engage in war, which is a euphemism for mass murder. If I don't have the right to issue taxes or regulate or draft people, I do not have the right to vote for John McCain or vote for Barack Obama to do such a thing on my behalf. All it is a group of people claiming the right to rule everyone else. There are a lot of criticisms of the free market. There's greed and there might be corruption, and all that is true. The problem with these criticisms is they all apply tenfold to the state. There's corruption. Yeah, governments have corruption. The difference is what makes libertarianism morally justified is you have the ability to opt out of funding corrupt people, of the ability to opt out of funding operations that do not work, that kill innocent people, or that don't make the poor better off. Economically speaking, we have two ways of achieving this. We can either fund things through a coercively funded monopoly, the state, and Medicare or something like that. Or we could embrace a philosophy of voluntarily funded competition. All the libertarian says is the principles of freedom we apply to our neighbors. We apply to a group called the Catholic Church and a group called Arizonans and a group called the Chinese. Everyone has the same moral standards. This is a philosophy that goes back deep into American history. All men are created equal. This means no person has the right to inherently rule over anyone else. They're endowed by a creator with certain unalienable rights. If we are to embrace the principles of Christianity, we have to be against murder, theft, robbery, kidnapping, and enslavement, even if a group of people called politicians engage in such an activity. If the Soviets did to, Chile what the U.S. did to Iraq, we would clearly see that it was immoral. Just hold that group called government to the same standards you hold anyone else. Declaration of Independence continues. People have the right to life. You have the right to live so long as you do not initiate violence against others. Then you are the aggressor, in which people have the right to defend themselves against you. The right to liberty. This is the ability to do anything you please so long as you do not initiate violence against someone else. That interferes with the freedom of someone else. So while we advocate freedom, we do not support the freedom to rape, enslave, kidnap, or murder. Is this a contradiction? Not at all. It's a philosophy that says you have the right to do anything you want. You have the right to pursue your happiness, as the Declaration of Independence says, so long as you do not claim ownership or initiate violence against a peaceful person. The Declaration of Independence goes on to say you have the right to alter or abolish government if it contradicts the ends stated at the beginning of the Declaration. My proposal is that we have the right to no longer recognize this group of people called Congress as legitimate. We simply apply the same standards we have for everyone else to that group, and that is essentially embracing libertarianism. We also have the right to free speech in the Constitution. Well, shouldn't we regulate speech to make sure it's for the greater good, just like we should regulate the economy? The answer is no, because any group of people that you say has the right to regulate is essentially saying that group of people has the right to rule everyone else, even if everyone else is engaging in voluntary interaction. The problem with neoconservatism is it grants the state the legitimacy that it doesn't have. It says, well, we could have a government that sort of regulates, that does a little regulation of the economy. Boom, you've already granted the left everything they've needed to justify communism. If a little taxation's okay for the greater good, well, then government's just engaging in helping the greater good with regard to every one of its evil schemes. Second Amendment, of course, is a libertarian principle. The state does not have the right to monopolize any weaponry. In other words, for the same reason we have separation of church and state, we should have separation of economy and state, separation of foreign policy and state. But what if someone believes in a wrong religion? Well, you know what? It's their life. But what if there's someone who is uneducated, and what if churches can't get funds? Shouldn't we tax people to make sure we have churches who get funds so we could teach morality so people know what's going on in the world? The answer is no. So whether it's a group of people called the Catholic Church or a group of people called Congress, the same moral principles apply. If we are to embrace the true ideology of conservatism, a care for civilization, and the recognition that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are things worth fighting for, we should embrace libertarianism, recognition of self-ownership, the non-aggression principle, voluntary exchange, original appropriation. These are the ideas that have made America great, not this idea that, well, violence isn't violence when the mass murdering, theft-funded, mass kidnapping government does it. That is my time. I will yield the rest to Mr. Castley.
Okay. Yeah, you still have a few minutes left, but if he's good with it, I guess, Kevin, you've got 15 minutes for your response.
Okay.
Let me reset this 1 sec. All right, there you go.
Wonderful. Yeah, so I'll just keep checking the private chat, see when I got 5 minutes left, that kind of thing. Okay, so thanks to Keith for coming on, and thanks to Henry for moderating, and thanks for everybody for tuning in tonight. So for me, in terms of all of this, I have, a somewhat brief opening statement, and then I'm going to proceed to address some of the points that Keith brought up, and then hopefully we can get into more of a discussion afterwards. And so the case for neoconservatism, the case is that we recognize that the world is anarchic. We recognize that that society in general, if left to its own devices, if essentially we were to surrender or find ourselves in the void, in which there were a chasm and no power we would descend into what Thomas Hobbes described as the state of nature. Now, Thomas Hobbes, for the record, when he conceived of the state of nature as, in his words, nasty, poor, brutish, and short, characterizing life within it, he was not talking about a real state of being that ever existed in human interaction. Rather, it was a theoretical, minimal existence that if it ever emerged, it would immediately find itself rendered, not applicable, because humans in that state of nature would immediately thereby covenant into interactions with each other, such that we would, by various means, we would come together to recognize a legitimized sovereign as having the power to order and provide structure. In other words, we covenant to give the state the sole monopoly on the legitimate use of force. And that to say that it's a double standard misses the point that it's inevitable, that it's necessary. And it's so necessary that not only without it would we descend into Thomas Hobbes' state of nature, as he described, but that state of nature wouldn't even exist, because we would immediately come back into covenanting into a social contract in which there would emerge from that a new state, a new king, a new ruler, a new Congress, what have you, whatever means, whatever body, because humans understand that hierarchy is necessary, that the tyranny of chaos is scarier than a legitimized ruler, and that the social Darwinist existence of the state of nature, the chaos of it, necessarily would serve as a tyranny, because now, instead of being able to be free to focus on doing whatever you do in your free time in civilization, now you have to spend all your time watching over your back because somebody might murder you, etc., that kind of thing. And in that anarchic state, there is no police to call upon. We live in a world which is in many ways characterized by that sort of state of nature at the international level. And in this international system, states can do to other states what they will, and the only force that's there to prevent it essentially is power. And in this system, what we see is that there are hegemons, there are great powers, there are superpowers, and if one superpower, for example, yields the world to another, the other will seize upon that opportunity and take the world. In other words, if America forgoes her responsibilities and says, America, she doesn't want to be the world police anymore, Russia and China will be happy to step in, and the world will be far worse as a result of it. And of course, so too will America in time, because good luck fighting off an invasion once they've got the whole world, versus if the war happens where you're on their border. Now, additionally, what neoconservatives understand is that the state is not this maniacal institution within the Western world, that the liberal democracy as we see it is actually a force for good, that we believe in a compassionate form of conservatism. We believe in a compassionate and magnanimous sort of institution that's there to essentially combine the pooled resources of the people, which we, as our own atomized selves, are very little, but that is a whole. We can do great things with it and become greater than the sum of our parts, that we can amass a large security apparatus to protect ourselves, that we can free up so much time that instead we would have to devote to our own personal security and our own personal agriculture to survive. That all of this, it produces an emergent system in which we sow the seeds for prosperity. And when we couple this with the liberal democratic world order, that of the capitalist system, the republic, the democracy, human rights, etc., we find a meaningful existence that we can forge from it, and that in this anarchic world, we are, incumbent upon us to essentially, spread this, to propagate this throughout the world. Because if we don't, our enemies will propagate their tyranny, and whether we like it or not, the world is as it is, and we must be the vanguard of liberty. And so I want to now get to some of the points briefly that were mentioned by Keith. And so I did take notes during his opening statement. So Keith, of course, invoked the non-aggression principle. I recently have produced a video called The Non-Aggression Principle is Immoral, Degenerate, and Stupid. My view of the non-aggression principle is basically this, that it is immoral to bear witness to genocide, to bear witness to murder, to bear witness to the most grotesque atrocities that we've witnessed, and to have the capacity to intervene and to not do it. And that, to me, it goes back to this point that we cannot surrender ourselves to nihilism. We have to stand for something. We have to be better. We have to be greater. And that in our pooled effort as a society, as you know, in terms of the West and in America specifically, there is the capacity to intervene. There is the capacity to make the world a better place, to not just take the world at face value, to not just say, oh, this is the world, this is how it is. The world is divided between islands of freedom and continents of slavery. But rather, we can forge the world into our own image. We don't have to ask permission to go somewhere and topple a dictator. We don't have to ask permission of some United Nations or something to go and fight some terrorists or to rid the world of communism. We can do that ourselves. We don't need the permission of anyone. We can be lions, we can be hawks, and we can make the world a far better place for ourselves, our own security, for humanity, and for posterity rather, into perpetuity. And so, additionally, the idea of tyranny, it is clear that there is tyranny in the world, and one of the problems that anarcho-capitalists and libertarians will have is that they will oftentimes regard the government in which they live, over the territory in which they live, as the worst tyranny, and neglect the relative degree of coercion that exists, where, yes, it is true that in Canada or the United States, the government does require you to pay your taxes. That's a little bit better than what happens in North Korea or communist China or fascist Russia. And so, and additionally, it is a necessary evil, if you will, with the state. Although I would note that I don't even consider it an evil per se. It depends what ideology we're working in. Moving on. In terms of security, I regard it, and I think it should be pretty self-evident, that you cannot have a secure society. You can't have secure communities unless we are able to, through the direction of a state entity, have an allocation of resources allotted to the security of our borders, as well as the propagation of our interests abroad. And that, as John Bolton said, it is better to engage in a conflict over there than to wait for them to engage in a conflict over here. And proceeding onward, I did want to talk about, now there was one thing, well, actually there was probably more than one thing, but there was one thing that stood out to me that Keith said that I agree with Keith on, which is that, and I've talked about this for a long time, I'm against the draft. I consider the draft to be degenerate. I believe that if you can't get enough people to sign up for the military, you have to offer higher salaries. I believe that the draft is antithetical to our principles, and so I reject it. Now, there are cases of extreme circumstances in South Korea and Israel that do necessitate a draft, but in Canada and the United States, I'm completely opposed to it, and that in a perfect world there would be no draft. You would have the military, offer higher salaries. I think that the military should be paid higher salaries. So that was the one thing that I would say I agreed with Keith on there, though there were probably more, but I just missed them. I did want to say that I did notice from Keith a blatant false equivalency that was drawn between the United States, which is I regarded not just as an exceptional country, because we know that the United Kingdom and Israel and Canada and Japan and Taiwan are all exceptional nations, but that they all would be Soviet communist gulag colonies without America, and therefore America is not exceptionalist. Rather, as I did in a video about a year ago, America is meta-exceptionalist. In other words, all exceptional countries of the West owe their existence to America and her great nuclear umbrella and her commitment to the defense of the free world. And additionally, I did want to talk about how yes, Russia does things. They're a state that engages in coercion of force, and America is a state that will also apply force abroad. However, America is the vanguard of liberty, and fascist Russia is a degenerate, oligopolistic backwater. And to regard their actions and America's actions as essentially, oh, they're somehow morally equal, misses the point that America is an exceptional entity. Additionally, here I did want to get into the idea of what Rumsfeld had mentioned about the Afghanistan war. The problem is the United States went into Afghanistan as a result of 9/11, but even if it were true, what Keith had mentioned, that war was still good. That war was still just. The Taliban's control over Afghanistan was a monstrosity. It was the sort of regime in which you could be murdered for listening to music, in which a woman could be murdered if the slightest bit of her ankle had been shown in the wind, that kind of thing. And it was something that we can all be proud of, that Canada and America and the Western coalition went in there and destroyed the Taliban. That was a great victory for neoconservatives. And to the extent that the Taliban still exists, they are less than a sixth of what they used to be in terms of their territorial control. And they would be all but gone if it were not for the weakness of these anti-war leaders such as Obama and Trump. So continuing on, the idea of a voluntary funding of war, it misses the point that we have negative externalities that come from voluntary interactions, and that it is these negative externalities that exist in social interaction as well as the economy that we as neoconservatives understand mandate and necessitate a degree of regulation and a degree of understanding that we can't just leave everybody to their own devices, because we will all undermine each other, even if we don't necessarily mean to, because there needs to be some order in place to keep us from imposing negative externalities upon each other. And there's a huge negative externality in security that results from, if we only have everybody who wants to pay for security pays for security, we will then have the negative externality known as the free rider problem, where everybody will want security, but nobody is personally willing to pay out of their own pocket, and therefore nobody will have security. And that's a huge issue with it. And so I know that we're still in opening statements time, but one question that I do have for Keith, and I'm looking forward to his response, is, do you believe that negative externalities exist in economics and social interaction? To kind of conclude here, because I know that my time is running out, I think that it's very clear that as far as the liberal order goes, as far as the democratic world goes, it is obvious that the neoconservatives are the champions of everything good in the world today, and that we will often hear a mischaracterization from our opponents on the left, on the right, that will regard neocons as a persuasion of failure, that they just have a record of failure. It could not be further from the truth. In fact, we are the force that brought about the demise of the Soviet Empire. We brought about the fall of communism in Europe and Central Asia. We additionally destroyed the Ba'athist regime in Iraq. That was a total and complete operational success. Ask Saddam how he's doing today. Oh, wait, you can't. He's dead. We killed him. Look at the situation in Afghanistan. The Afghan people have a free government now, and women aren't just being completely butchered wholesale as they used to be. The situation everywhere that the neocons have applied our will, the world has been forged into a better status quo than it was prior. We are victors, we are lions, we are hawks, and we're not done yet, and we are rising up once more, and we will have a neoconservative renaissance, and mark my words, we will forge the world into our own image once again. So thank you. And I yield my time. What little is remaining.
Okay. Yeah, you're just about out anyway. All right, yeah, if you want to go into the more open exchange portion of this, and I guess we'll start off with Keith, because I'm sure he's got a lot to say in response to that. And I think he also has some questions for Kevin. So if you wanted to go ahead and take us away on that, Keith.
Sure. I just want to address the negative externalities claim. This is what my point was previously when I said there are a number of objections to the free market philosophy, the ideology of self-ownership and voluntary exchange. However, it in no way justifies the state. For example, if a group of people in Congress, just like 260 of them, would be a majority, or let's say 300 of them would be a majority, that would be a negative externality on the 330 million Americans who do not appreciate or care for the laws that they pass, considering they never ask us before. I mean, Congress has like an 11% approval rating. So the biggest externality we have is the existence of government. So just focusing on negative externalities, it's literally like saying negative externalities exist. Therefore, the Koch brothers have the right to rule all of America, and if we don't obey the Koch brothers, we should be put in a cage and shot if we resist. This is because negative externalities exist. It doesn't solve the problem of negative externalities that, well, I grant you, absolutely does exist. We have no ability or no recourse against the state when they engage in their constant negative externalities. As far as the free rider problem goes, well, there's a large number of people who do not chip into the tax system, which Mitt Romney got in trouble for telling the truth about this, saying 47% of Americans are not net taxpayers. Well, he's right. So that is an example of the existence of a state does not solve the free rider problem, nor does it solve the problem of negative externalities. Therefore, the existence of externalities does not justify the existence of a state or a ruling class or a group of people that have the right to initiate aggression against peaceful individuals. How do you respond, Mr. Castley?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, 2 points there. Basically, the first was the point about externalities. The second was on the free rider program or problem rather, and the 47%. So on the issue of externalities, I think what we're missing here is that if there were, yes, I will grant you 100% that there are still negative externalities that exist as a result of the state, and that there are new externalities that can result from the state's presence, such as corruption. And we can see that in Russia, for example, where it's extremely heightened in that, you know, there's obviously a massive problem with the government picking winners and losers in terms of the oligarchy and everything over in Russia. Now, in America, though, yes, there are externalities that do emerge. However, if the government were not there, if we were to go to a stateless society, for example, you would have so many new negative externalities that emerge from that, coupled with existing externalities that would be exacerbated as a result of no more regulations or anything, that on the whole, on the net, you would be worse off than you were under the current status quo. And when I say worse off, I mean orders of magnitude worse off. That's not to say that it's perfect now by any means. There are a lot of reforms that I advocate for all the time, but we at least have the means to go about doing them and everything. The second was, actually, there was a third point, so I'll get to that briefly. You mentioned how Congress has an 11% approval rating. That tends to be fairly consistent around there, between 10 and 20% over the years. The thing that's missed there, though, is when you pull each particular district and you ask people, what's your view of your congressman or your congresswoman? Most people have a favorable view of their own personal representative, but they regard Congress as an institution fairly objectively negatively. But their own congressman, they're like, oh, well, he's great, but we don't like the others. And everybody has that view where they like their own. And of course, that's the case because they had to get elected. They had to win. If they didn't like them, they'd vote them out in the next election. And so that's how that results. But it makes sense that you see a lot of the gridlock that happens in Congress and everything. And so people don't necessarily like that, even if they like their own congressman. So it misses the broader picture there. But the last point that was brought up was about the free rider problem. And you mentioned how, and it's true that about 47% roughly are they are on the whole drains on the tax system. They aren't positive contributors to it. That is true. However, I would argue that if there were no state, you would go from having basically 47% of people that were, in essence, leeches to having, say, 99% of people that were leeches. Because, yes, in theory, it would be good to have security, but nobody's going to pay for it if they aren't required to. Whereas at least now it's 47%. I would argue without a state, nothing would basically get done, because you'd have a very, very small, tiny minority of people that would make it like their charity sort of thing. And everybody else, even if they said, oh yeah, that's good, but like, I'm not paying for that. And the whole thing would fall apart. And so this does raise one question that I have over to Keith, which is that how would a stateless society be able to defend itself from a rival superpower such as Russia or China that did have a cohesive order and had nuclear weapons? How would militias, how would a voluntarist system be able to win a war with China if they decide to invade, for example?
So the best mechanism for defeating a superpower would be to turn the populist against the current ruler. For example, whether it's President Xi or socialist secular dictator Saddam Hussein. The method you would use is to hack their computers and send a PDF to all the emails of a document titled Anatomy of the State by a professor from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, Murray N. Rothbard. What you essentially would do is delegitimize the existence of the ruler in that country to strip them of their power. There currently exists a general understanding between the rulers that they will not either target each other, nor will they go to their populations and explain why the other ruler is inherently illegitimate. So if you were to go to China and explain the principled difference between the Marxist ideas that they sort of generate, the class struggle that they advocate, and you were to say, hey, the real exploiter is not the bourgeoisie or the capitalist or people who invest their time and efforts into products and services and voluntarily make them available to the masses. The great exploiter in society is President Xi and his allies. This would actually turn people against the current regime. The Central Intelligence Agency actually did this with documents in Nicaragua, where instead of fighting the people, you end up punishing civilians for what dictators do. And as much as the dictators kind of suffer, the civilians really suffer, and they're already suffering under the dictators. As far as the free rider problem goes, well, if you take all the time and effort and energy we currently put into begging politicians to pass laws on our behalf, and then hopefully the judges rule in such a way that the laws are beneficial to the masses at large, well, then maybe you can reap benefits. The free rider problem would be less of a detriment in a voluntarist society that recognized the principles of natural law, the principles of the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal with rights endowed by a creator. The reason you would have less of this is because you would have more charity. People would find it in their self-interest to increase their social status by tweeting about how they donate to this organization and how they're a member of this police department and how they're a member of donating to this fire department. You don't get real innovation if you have coercive funding. You get the same thing you have always gotten with terrible government programs. So if we want innovation, if we want improvement, if we want an increase in accessibility to people at lower income levels so everyone can have security, the last thing we would want to do is give the state a coercively funded monopoly on providing such security. Again, I just want to point out that Mr. Castley has not explained why this group called government has a different standard, whereas if it were generally justified that it's okay to force someone to pay for something because they might free ride, well, then everyone would have the right to do it. The Catholic Church would have the right to force you to fund them and their security agency. Any security agency would have the right to force you to fund them, because if you didn't fund them, you'd be engaging in the free rider problem. And Amazon would have the right to force you to fund their security agency. The neoconservatism standpoint, rather, has not explained why this group of people has the double standard and not this group. It's not because government is so moral and so kind and so virtuous and the people there are so smart and so consistent. It's just a contradiction that has yet to be justified.
Okay, so there are a lot of points there. The first one that I wanted to get into was you brought up the case of if an enemy superpower invaded America, you would wage an information war against them. You would get everybody in the country to send PDFs of Rothbard's work over to people in China to delegitimize Xi Jinping. The problem with this is that we live in a free country already. I've seen some of Rothbard's thoughts and everything, and it hasn't convinced me, and I live in a free country. Now imagine you're in China, and now all of a sudden you open up your email and you've got this leaflet from somebody in the United States, and you're like, oh, most people aren't even going to open it. Some are going to report it to the government, and the ones who might start reading it, if they actually start taking it seriously, they're going to be disappeared in the night and taken to gulags. So it's not going to do anything to undermine their state. And additionally, on top of that, it would be very hard to get very many people to even send this out, because it's hard to coordinate these sorts of endeavors without a state. Additionally, you'd have to keep in mind that at this point, Chinese troops are occupying like U.S. cities and everything, because there's no big standing army to defeat them, no big funding or anything. Additionally, you mentioned the idea that government's clunky, government's stagnant, and doesn't do innovation very well, whereas the private enterprise and charity is far better at doing that. The problem with this is I don't necessarily even disagree with you. It depends on which government, because of course we could look at the UK before Thatcher and see that they were very inefficient, very big government, very not innovative, right? But that Thatcher's reforms made them better. But Thatcher didn't get rid of the state. She took the necessary institution of the state and made it so that it would be smaller and allow the private enterprise to take hold. But that if you got rid of the state altogether, free companies would immediately devolve into monopolies and whatnot. Additionally, I did want to say, though, that this isn't even necessarily true, though, because, well, the big state enterprises, the big state institutions might technically be slower on the margin than say a company like Amazon or something. The problem is, even a big company can't pool the necessary resources together to create the internet, for example, whereas the US Pentagon can, because they have a much larger budget that comes from this emergent system where all of our tax money as an individual taxpayer isn't that much, but that in aggregate it adds up to do great things. And that these great things that the US military has produced that have made civilian life so much better, the internet, you were taking like freeze-dried food, all this kind of stuff that came out of the military, all this stuff, satellite communication, cell phones, etc. All this stuff wouldn't even exist if it were left up to private charity. We would still be in basically almost a feudal era, except we wouldn't, because a state that was against us would have taken us over by now, because that kind of system cannot stand up to states armed with nuclear weapons and cohesive standing armies that could just, like, how is a militia in the woods going to stop a nuclear weapon, for example? That's my issue, right? So again, I guess a bit broader than the last question, but if two questions. If Rothbard isn't convincing to people in a free society, how would that strategy work in a tyranny like China? And second, how would the United States without a government be able to actually defend itself from an invading army that did have a cohesive standing force, such as China, Russia, etc.? Even Canada, in this example, would have a more cohesive and equipped military at this point.
So Stefan Molyneux goes over this in his book, Practical Anarchy. He says, you are the king of a geographical area. You have two countries to invade. One country has a disarmed populace because they have a government and a monopoly on violence. And all you have to do is defeat that monopoly on violence, those people and their bases, and you have the allegiance of the country. All the propaganda that country uses to get its citizens to obey them, you now have, because you've defeated that single army. The second country that you can choose to invade has a populace that does not recognize your right to rule, and you will be facing a guerrilla war. You could say that you might get bogged down in Afghanistan, like the British and the Soviets and America currently is. you would get bogged down in such a place that it would be so hard to rule over the geographical area because no one recognizes your right to rule. It would literally be the equivalent of me putting a crown on my head and walking from Chandler, Arizona to Tempe, Arizona and say, hey guys, I just want to let you know I am currently the ruler of Tempe, Arizona. As I tried to dictate people around, I would have my head blown off, certainly in Arizona, before I was able to enforce any of my edicts. Because the people don't recognize your right to rule, that would strip away the very power you would have. So whether it's literally sending emails to the citizenry of your opposition, it might even include assassinating the people at the top echelons of your opposition. For example, Ho Chi Minh during the Vietnam War was actually, according to Bob Bergen at CIA.gov, was a collaborator with the Office of Strategic Services, what we today call the CIA, just as Saddam was palling around with Donald Rumsfeld in the Iraq-Iran war, just as the Mujahideen were being funded by the Americans. If you want to know who the next enemy is going to be, all you have to do is look at who they are currently funding. These are not wars to defend us. What they are strategic games to build up an enemy to justify the existence of a next war. Even the Soviets, according to, of all people, National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, in, I believe it's his book, Between Two Ages, where he cites the work of Anthony Sutton. It's titled Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development, 1945 to 1973. He cites that you can't have a state without, you can't have a parasite without a producer. You can't have a state without the entrepreneur. So what happens is people like Friedrich Engels, who funded Karl Marx to write the Communist Manifesto, Jacob Schiff, who funded the Bolshevik Revolution, George Soros, who is funding Bolshevism in America today. In order for these tyrannies to exist, they need a productive people to exploit. If you focus on getting the productive people to no longer recognize the legitimacy of the actual exploiters, not the Marxist nonsensical exploitation theory, then that is how you would defeat an enemy, along with not recognizing their legitimacy or their right to rule. You would more or less assassinate the dictators of the opposition. That is how you would fight a nuclear power.
Okay, so I've got some responses to that. So you talked about how you would basically engage in guerrilla war against this power. I would argue, though, that they'd still be able to take over and occupy central facilities and whatnot to make life very difficult, and that life would suck under that, and that even if you were able to wear them down, that wouldn't actually result in a stable equilibrium, because then somebody else would just come in and you'd be in this perpetual state of fighting, new powers that would come in. And additionally, one thing that I wanted to mention was that the characterization that you've kind of been engaging in here is this implied stance of mine that I'm somehow anti-Second Amendment. I'm a huge fan of the Second Amendment, big fan of gun rights. And I think that a state, like you mentioned those two examples, one where the people have no guns and the state has the guns, versus one where the state doesn't exist and the people have the guns. Well, no, here's what I would argue is the best hedgehog, the best security, the best position to be in. Live in a state where the people have guns and the government has guns, like the United States, where you have a strong collective security that's amassed by the Pentagon and everything, but at the same time, you have a defense from any potential excess of ambition by the government, because you've got an armed population to keep the government in check. And additionally, if anybody does invade the United States, they not only do they have to go through the United States military, they also have to go through, 150 million Americans with 400 million guns. I like that. So just for the record here, I'm a big fan of the Second Amendment. I'm also a big fan of the state. So that's my view of it. So
what if there is a government and another government takes over?
Wait, can you clarify what you mean exactly?
So if there's a government in Poland and a government invades Poland and takes over, then what happens? Because you've lost. Your terrible anarchic scenario has come to fruition in Poland and France and hundreds of millions of other geographical areas that have existed since ancient Egypt. My position is not anarchism is perfect because my position is anarchism is superior because it doesn't rely on initiating violence against peaceful people, allows people to pursue their happiness so long as they don't initiate violence against other people, and coercively funded monopolies are inferior to voluntarily funded competing organizations. So the idea that, look, there are terrible shortcomings in a free society. There are terrible shortcomings in a society that allows for voluntary marriage. That does not justify the existence of the state prearranging marriages, just as there are terrible shortcomings in the existence of the free market society. That doesn't justify a state any more than it justifies George Soros ruling over us, because in the absence of George Soros ruling over us, there would be negative externalities, and we might get taken over by a foreign regime. If the people do not recognize their right to rule, they cannot take over any society. It would be as dumb as me going into Afghanistan with a crown on my head saying, I am Mullah Omar. I hereby declare being the ruler of this geographical area. It just cannot happen without the general recognition of the populace at large that this person or group of people have the right to rule this general area. Therefore, the best defense against aggressing nations is the general institutionalized recognition of the self-ownership principle, voluntary exchange, and libertarian anarchism.
Okay, so you mentioned, or you asked, what would happen to Poland if another state invaded. We could just look at history. The Nazis had a stronger military. They invaded Poland, and then Poland was butchered. And then afterwards, at the same time, actually, the Soviets invaded the eastern part and then butchered the Poles. So what happened was the Poles had a weak state, they had a weak government, and they didn't have the same hard military power or alliances as Nazi Germany and their sphere of influence in the USSR. So they got totally butchered and carved up. And that's what happened. And then after that, they became Nazi, then they became communist, and now they're a free country. And now one thing to note about Poland has a very based and strong state now. And they also have a very based militia that's actually bigger than the army, because the people there know their history and they know what happens if another state takes them over. So they understand that you have to combine personal militias with the state. You can't just do one or the other. And so Poland is a hedgehog, and if Putin tries to invade Poland now, he's going to have a hard time of it. Plus they're in NATO, so they have the alliance there. You mentioned the case of Afghanistan. It would actually be relatively easy to take over Afghanistan if you had no morality. All that you would do is go in with a superior force, round up all the men, execute them, enslave all the women. That's what they used to do, like in the Peloponnesian War, for example. And then there you go. You won Afghanistan. The reason why the British didn't do that, even the Soviets didn't do that, and why America didn't do that is because none of these countries actually had the interest in actually 100% doing that. Now obviously the Soviets were brutal, and they were obviously the closest to that. The British were also pretty brutal. America, in contrast, was there to fight terrorism and everything. But on this point, it would actually be relatively easy. It'd be like making mincemeat of the Melians. You just go in, kill all the men, enslave all the women, or just kill all the women too, and then bring over your colonizers and set up, like New Britain in Afghanistan. It'd actually be pretty easy to do if there was no cohesive state to defend itself. What you're missing, Keith, is that in anarchy, in the absence of a police, the absence of a Leviathan, to invoke Thomas Hobbes, you can do anything. And guess what would happen in that case? You could say that's horrible, that's brutal, that's a barbaric thing. But guess what? 2,000 years down the road, Afghanistan's still New Britain. They won. Nobody's going to do anything about it. It's like, yeah, you killed all the men, killed all the women. Now you won. It's like a state with no morals would be able to take that territory pretty easily. So now I'm not saying to do that. I'm just saying that what happens if it's Hitler? Hitler straight up was fully intent on exterminating every single Ukrainian. And let's say he did that and he got away with it. Would anything happen to him? No, because he got away with it, because there is no guiding police force in the world. I want America to be that guiding police force to keep order and everything, and the West at large. I want us all to spend 8% on the military. But you mentioned something, and I want to go to this. There were a couple points. The first, and I'll make this quick. The first question I have, I'm going to need a citation on George Soros funding Bolshevism in America. I'm not a neoliberal. I don't even like George Soros, but that's a bit hyperbolic. And second, you mentioned the Mujahideen. I have a question for you, Keith. what do you think was a greater threat to America in the 80s? The evil empire, the communists aiming 40,000 nuclear weapons at America with the potential to kill most of America's population in 3 or 4 hours, or some guys in the desert, some of whom 25 years down the road helped others kill 3,000 Americans in 2001, which is a bigger threat in the 1980s? So those are my two questions.
Bigger threat in the 1980s is the Soviet Union. Proof George Soros is funding Bolshevism in America is his open funding of the Open Societies Foundation, which advocates the ideology of socialism, the institutionalized recognition of private property. The institutionalized aggression against private property, which is in contrast to civilization and known as capitalism, the institutionalized recognition of private property and non-aggressive contractual exchanges between private property owners. There is my my evidence.
Okay, so we'll go point by point. So first point, you came to the same conclusion as me, the Soviet Union. So then that raises the question, what do you do about it? You got to do everything in your power to fight the evil empire, because if you don't fight like your life depends on it, they will, and they will bury you. And so you have to work with Pinochet, even though he's a bad guy. You have to work with the Contras, even though they're bad guys. And you have to work with the Mujahideen, even though they're bad guys, because the communists are worse. So you can understand that the Mujahideen was the guys to work with, as opposed to letting the Soviets take over Afghanistan, right? So it seems like we're almost in agreement there. Is that correct?
Correct. There is there are times where you have to side with evil people in order to conquer a greater evil. There's nothing anti-libertarian about that. As I mentioned in my opening statement, in order to justify a war, what you would want is voluntary funding, voluntary association, and to only use aggression defensively against people who are already aggressing. I do want to ask you about Afghanistan. So if I look at decision points, page 192 by George Bush, I laid out an ultimatum to the Taliban. They will hand over the terrorists or they will share their fate. We had little hope that Afghanistan leaders would heed it, but exposing their defiance to the world would firm up our justification for a military strike. If I look at the Guardian article, along with CBC News, White House says no to Taliban demand for proof that they were behind 9/11 or they are associating with Al-Qaeda operatives. Gareth Porter, U.S. refusal of 2001 Taliban offer gave bin Laden a free pass, according to the Internal Press Service. U.S. rejects new Taliban offer. ABC News, October 14, 2001. Bush rejects Taliban bin Laden offer. Washington Post, October 14, 2001. Along with new offer on bin Laden, according to The Guardian, October 16, 2001. Should the U.S. have invaded Afghanistan or negotiated to hand over bin Laden and Anwar al-Zawahiri?
Yeah, we shouldn't negotiate with terrorists. The Taliban are in and of themselves absolute terrorists. They were accomplices to 9/11. They were as responsible for 9/11 as the driver in a drive-by shooting who's driving the vehicle while the passenger riding shotgun shoots your kid. You'd still want that driver to go to jail for a long ass time. You wouldn't be like, oh, he's just the driver. It was the passenger who shot the gun. It's like, no, they're both accomplices. Now, yes, the Taliban didn't want to be invaded by America, so they were happy to sell out these terrorists that they worked with and be like, okay, well, we'll rat out on these guys now, just spare us. That's what happens with criminal enterprises. Oftentimes, like, let's say two guys, let's call them Al-Qaeda and Taliban, two guys in LA, they go and rob a bank. And then the cops catch up with them. And then Taliban says, hey, man, I'll tell you where Al-Qaeda's hiding. Just like, don't put me in jail, man. That happens all the time. That doesn't mean they're not both guilty of robbing the bank or both accomplices. It simply means that the Taliban was perfectly fine to sell out their old comrades. That doesn't make them the good guys, and it doesn't make them not responsible. And you got to kill the Taliban, and you got to kill Al-Qaeda, because they were both responsible, and you don't negotiate with terrorists. That's my stance on it, and I'm very glad that the Bush administration had the moral high ground to go after both and bring them both to justice. That was based in Hawkpill. Now, additionally, I did want to get to something which you mentioned. You mentioned, Keith, you mentioned about how well, actually, you mentioned a couple of things. The first thing that I wanted to mention was when you talked about how it's not incongruent with libertarianism to actually work with bad actors abroad, to help you. That's actually a point there where when you were talking about how, yes, you sometimes have to work with bad guys against bigger bad guys, you're now in agreement with Gene Kirkpatrick, the notorious neoconservative. So that's actually a point of common ground now you're having with a neoconservative, Gene Kirkpatrick, who had the Kirkpatrick doctrine of, supporting right-wing dictatorships out there in Latin America, in the Middle East, etc., working with, Muslims and stuff against communists. So we have an area of agreement between a libertarian and a neoconservative. So that's cool. Additionally, you mentioned the defensive aspect of it. I guess I've got a question for you, Keith, which is that if it's very clear that a future enemy or an enemy today that hasn't attacked you yet is building up their arsenal, doesn't it make sense to go in and kick their ass before they come for you versus waiting for them to come for you so you can have some moral justification to fight back? So, for example, let's talk about North Korea. It's very clear with North Korea that they're building up enough nukes, as I've talked about on my channel for a long time, to blackmail America so that they can invade the South and tell America, you're not going to stand up to your security considerations. You're going to let us go in there and take your guys prisoner, and you're not going to stop us, because if you do, we'll nuke all your cities. It's obvious that that's what they're going to do. Should America launch the first strike and take them out before they get enough nukes to do that? Or should America wait and be caught? I guess that's my question, because it seems like waiting for the enemy to fight on their terms is stupid. So that's why I'm a massive advocate, a huge supporter of preemptive war. So
as far as preemptively striking an enemy, I would simply have you're going to be shocked, the libertarian response of making sure that we don't have a double standard for government as opposed to aggressors. So if I have a plan, and here I have it written out, I'm going to kill Bob. I'm going to go to Bob's house, and then I'm going to wait till he's asleep, and then I'm going to kill Bob. Well, if at some point, if I say I hate him, that is not a justification to shoot me in the head. Well, if I have a total plan and all-out operation to murder this peaceful individual, then you would not be initiating aggression. You would be responding to an open-ended aggressor. Again, I am not against stopping people from initiating violence when they have already demonstrated themselves to be a threat. All I'm saying is I don't have a double standard for government. So when it comes to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, if I cite a June 14th, 2001, before 9/11, Mullah Omar says about bin Laden is null and void. This is who is often referred to as the father of Afghanistan's Taliban, Mullah Omar, also known as Muhammad Omar. He said that bin Laden is like a chicken bone in my throat. I can neither swallow him nor spit him out. When we're talking about Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, we're talking about two different organizations. Granted, we're talking about two different competing evil tyranny organizations who I am not siding with at all. But the idea that we had to invade Afghanistan and we had to be bogged down in a 20-year war is not the case at all. We could have treated 9/11 as we treated something like any other terrorist crime. As a crime, we would have gone after the people. We would have looked at who had the incentive to create the bombs or fly the planes in the first place. And then we would have gone after those individuals who actually participated in the immoral actions. We would not have justified a war. For example, if I commit an act of evil, you wouldn't go to war against Arizona. You would go to war against me and my co-conspirators. All I'm saying is the same principle you have for people in this geographical area called America, you have for this geographical area called Afghanistan or Africa or China or the Middle East or anything else. Because the neoconservatism philosophy does not address that double standard is why it is wrong and libertarianism is right.
Wait, we do address the double standard that you bring up, though. I just want to quickly go to the point about the Taliban, though. The Taliban harbored Al Qaeda. They were supporters. And then afterwards, when it was clear that the U.S. was going to invade, they sold out Al Qaeda. That's pretty clear. That doesn't make them the good guys. And additionally, when you mentioned those incentives and stuff, I want to touch on something that you mentioned in your opening statements. You talked about how Al Qaeda used their justification being that, you know, they hate the Saudi royals and they hate that the West is in Saudi Arabia. That's like their main point. They want to get the West out of Saudi Arabia. It almost seemed like victim blaming, where it was almost implying that America asked for 9/11 by standing with her allies, because Saudi Arabia is a great ally of America, for example, and the royals are our friends. And without them, you would have an Islamic State like ISIS, led by Wahhabist clerics, that would be causing untold destruction in the region. The House of Saud is a great force for stability in the region, and they actively help against Iran and Russia, for example, in terms of oil as well as military considerations. So when you talked about investigate their incentives, we know what Al Qaeda's incentives were. They hated America. They wanted America out of Saudi Arabia so that they could butcher Saudi Arabia and go on their jihad and everything. And so who would you go after? I've got a question for you, Keith, because when you say you would go after those who did it and look at their incentives, who would you go after? Would it just be bin Laden and you'd leave the Taliban alone? Is that it?
No, I would have taken the Taliban's offer to hand over bin Laden. I would also have them hand over Ayman al-Zawahiri, the Egyptian doctor who took over the Azam group with Osama bin Laden. I would also have them hand over Zarqawi, who was advocating an Islamic State in Iraq. This is someone clearly in opposition to the non-aggression principle that totally would have been justified. Maybe even some Taliban leaders. I don't know all the specifics, but all I know is that starting a 20-year war against a nation where, according to the official story written by Philip Zelikow, 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, not Afghanistan. The others were from the United Arab Emirates.
No, bin Laden and those guys were exiled. Not all of them were exiled, but to say that they were Saudi, that's like saying that if somebody from Canada goes and signs up with ISIS and they go and commit a terrorist attack, say in Lebanon, that, actually that guy was from Canada, so therefore it was Canada's fault. I got news, man. Saudi Arabia, the House of Saud, despises Al Qaeda. They're enemies. They've been at war. To blame Al Qaeda and those guys being Saudi on the Saudi government is, look, I'm just going to say it's basically racist. It's basically saying, look, they're Arabs, Saudi Arabia, like they have nothing in common with the Saudi royalty. So they hate the Saudi royals.
Not at all. The U.S. sided with Saudi Arabia, and in doing so, they supported Al Qaeda in Iraq while taking out Saddam. They supported Al Qaeda in Syria against Assad. They supported Al Qaeda in Libya against Gaddafi.
That sounds like some left-wing propaganda, man. That sounds like some Russia Today propaganda. That's not true.
Which part?
The funding Al Qaeda, working with Al Qaeda in Syria, that's not true. That's like a Jimmy Dore.
That is completely true.
That is not true. I need a citation, bro.
It's called Operation Timber Sycamore, in which Jacob Sullivan, the current national security advisor for Joe Biden, sent a memo to Hillary Clinton. Make sure Hillary knows we're on Al Qaeda's side in Syria against.
No. That's fake news. That's literally fake news.
Against Assad. So Jake Sullivan didn't say that the U.S. is siding with Al Qaeda against Assad in Syria. How about Joe Biden, the current president of America, at Harvard, saying we sided with al-Nusra in Syria because there's no Thomas Jefferson, there's no James Madison for us to side with? How about General Michael Flynn on Al Jazeera saying we saw the rise of ISIS because we wanted Assad gone to weaken Iran? How about John Kerry when he was on recorded tape saying we saw the rise of the Islamic State, but we thought we could handle it? This is what they do. This is who they empower.
Like, I'm not a fan of John Kerry. He's a pigeon. Look, here's the deal. With everything there, you talk about Al Qaeda and al-Nusra in Syria. I got news, dude. Those guys are horrible. And to say that the United States worked with Al-Qaeda is basically a conspiracy theory that's been debunked. However, even if it were true, Bashar the Butcher has killed over 500,000 Syrians and forced 8 million to flee to Europe. In comparison to that, those guys look like angels. Why not work with the lesser evil? We worked with Pinochet, worked with the Mujahideen, worked with all kinds of actors before. Now, I'm not saying that the United States worked with Al-Qaeda. The U.S. worked with some aspects of, for example, the Free Syrian Army that turned out to later on, as well as some of the democratic opposition that, as the war drew on, became more radicalized because they saw that the West didn't offer very much support at all, and they turned to more extreme routes. You mentioned in Afghanistan, well, you're not in favor of starting a 20-year war. Neither am I. The war would have been over way sooner if we had just stayed the course and done the surge and then proceeded it up with helping the state get itself together and doing some nation building. Most of that time wouldn't have even been conflict. The war would have been over in like 10, 15 years. It draws on because we have people like you trying to undermine the commitment, the troop presence, the force application in these areas. And so I want to end the endless wars by winning them. I don't want to do a yo-yo thing where we pull out after 20 years, but we haven't solved the problem. So now they strike again, and now we have to go back because now the people want to get blood for those that killed their families in another 9/11 and so on and so forth. Let's just get rid of the problem, nip it in the bud. You talk about working with Saudi Arabia as if that's somehow bad. Saudi Arabia is one of America's most loyal allies. They've done so much to help the West. They work with Israel. Think about that. This is a state that used to embargo America for recognizing Israel, and now they work with Israel. This is a state that used to ban women from doing anything, that now women have some minimal freedoms, and they're moving in the right direction. That Saudi Arabia has done worlds to help with Iran, with Russia, for example, to undercut Putin on oil prices, and that hurts Putin big time. You look at 2014, for example. I mean, it looks like you're taking Taliban and Al-Qaeda talking points and saying they're mad about us, so therefore let's not be us. It's like, how about this? Let's be lions and hawks and admit that, yes, Al-Qaeda doesn't like what we're doing. You know what? They can go and cry about it. They can go and jerk each other off and be upset about it and everything. That's their business. That's like, they're going to be upset about that. You know what? Good. I want them to fume and doom because they're my enemies. It's kind of like saying, well, Kim's scared that America's got nukes, so he wants nukes. I'm like, oh yeah, I get why he wants nukes. I get why he's scared. He should be scared. I'm not playing sympathy for the devil here. I want to nuke his ass. That's me. So.
The problem is you're not nuking Kim. You're going to end up nuking the civilians that Kim is already oppressing. When it comes to Saudi Arabia, they are an ally in the same way Ghislaine Maxwell is an ally to Jeffrey Epstein. They are an ally in the mass murder atrocities that exist in Yemen. Let me give you an example.
That was Iran that started that. The Houthis.
You got to let him finish, Kevin. Okay. You got to let him finish his statement, man.
So I do want to move on. Please respond to that in your response to this as well. In 1993, Bill Clinton gassed his own people in Waco, Texas. Would Russia be justified in blockading America, staging a coup, and installing a new president because Bill Clinton gassed his own people in Waco, Texas?
The people at Waco were criminals and thugs and insurrectionists and seditious traitors. Russia, in contrast, is an evil empire that has no moral high ground. America is an exceptional superpower. And to say, oh, well, Russia is a different state. What if they did something? Like if Russia does something, like let's say Russia goes into Syria. I don't like that. They're my enemy. If America goes into Syria, great. I've been advocating for that for a long time. It should happen in 2011. There are different states with different ideologies, different morality. I support America. I don't support Russia. And as far as the thugs and terrorists at Waco, they deserved what happened to them. I'll say that. So,
how about the children at Waco? Did they deserve to be lit on fire by the FBI spraying CS gas and initiating a fire after a 51-day standoff and blockade?
Collateral damage happens in every conflict. It's not something that you root for, but it's an inevitable part of dealing with those that wage violence against you. So
Exactly, and the Branch Davidians were not initiating violence against anyone. The ATF originally came there to stage an Operation Showtime, which was to resolve them of the atrocities they committed against Vicky Weaver at Ruby Ridge. So this again is more false nonsense that the government creates a problem so they can allegedly give us a solution, which is no more justified than what was happening beforehand. For example,
they were a cult. They were a cult, dude. They didn't look. They were a cult. The kids weren't going to be able to leave.
Yeah, yes, they were. That's why David Koresh allowed people to leave. I think there were 31 people who left before day 51. That's according to David Thibodeau, a Waco survivor who wrote a book called A Place Called Waco, and I interviewed on my channel. This is all fake news. It's the idea that, well, government murder isn't really murder because there's other bad people. For example, Mormonism or Scientology or the belief in statism is a cult. The idea that the president said words and then wrote them on paper, so we have to abide by his executive orders. That is a cult. That does not give me the right to murder you any more than it gives the FBI the right to murder the Branch Davidians. They were totally peaceful until the ATF initiated violence against them. That is an actual example of how people like you will justify violence against American citizens because you've already justified it against people in a different geographical area. That is the problem with neoconservatism. It hurts you just as much as it hurts anyone else, and it also happens to be immoral and inconsistent. But that's the utilitarian argument against it, is the chickens will come home to roost.
Wait, so you're just going to tolerate that sort of behavior to go unchecked? Basically, that's what we're dealing with. And you also mentioned, oh well, just because the president signs it, it's just a social construct, bro. That sort of thing. No, I actually happen to believe that the president is the legitimate leader of the free world as elected by the people of the United States, and that his or her words mean things, and that you can choose to go the sovereign citizen route and say, oh, I'm not going to pay attention to that or whatever. That's fine, as long as you still follow the laws and everything. And if you violate that, I know I was listening to one of your episodes that you had done recently, and if I recall correctly, you said, look, if a citizen goes out and kidnaps somebody, that's a crime called kidnapping. But if the government puts somebody in jail, that's called incarceration. I got a question for you, Keith. Are you actually opposed to incarceration? Are you opposed to prisons and jail?
Not at all. All my standard is if I have the right to do it, then a group of people called Congress would have the right to do it. If I don't have the right to do it, then I don't have the right to delegate to Congress people a right to do it. So, for example, I have the right to put people in cages for murder, most types of fraud, most types of theft, and for things like kidnapping and trying to enslave other human beings. That is not a violation of the libertarian principle. It is embracing the libertarian principle of self-defense and non-aggression to deter the aggressors, not to nuke the city that they happen to live in because everyone is a co-conspirator. All I'm saying is that I hold government to the same standards I'd hold anyone else to. So you have the right to cage a murderer and shoot him if he resists because he has demonstrated himself to initiate violence against peaceful people. That is the root of libertarianism. What differentiates murder from killing someone who's initiating violence against you? They're invalidating your consent. The difference between sex and rape, consent, embracing the libertarian principle. Difference between employment and enslavement, consent, the embracing of the libertarian principle. The difference between trade and theft, the principle of non-aggression. That is who belongs in a cage. Now, most of these people happen to belong in politics who engage in the large-scale violations of the non-aggression principle. So, of course, I'm not against prisons. I'm against caging people who initiate violence against peaceful people because I do not recognize that as a legitimate form of civilization and human beings interacting with one another.
So, okay, a couple points here. The first is, So yes, you can do a citizen's arrest, but you can't just do all kinds of things at your own will. You need to have, the legal authority to do so. And we have a justice system so that we don't have cruel and unusual punishment, all that kind of stuff. We have a standardized system of justice by trained judges and everything that can mete out a fair punishment in that case, and that's why we have police and everything. Now, here's the problem. Somebody could just as easily say, hey man, he didn't do anything wrong, you're the bad guy and all this, and it creates this infinite loop where now somebody can kill you, because we need to have standards. Now, I'm not saying you can't take matters into your own hands out of self-defense. That is true, you can do that, but you got to call the cops in other circumstances. But as far as incarceration and everything goes, it basically sounded like to me what you were arguing was that it's just the state, and the state doesn't have any sort of like higher legitimacy or whatever, which misses the point that the state in a representative democracy as the United States has a higher order legitimacy, because we entrust into them an authority that as individuals we can't necessarily do. And so I've got a question for you, Keith, which is that should individual citizens be allowed to just mine uranium, enrich plutonium, and build nukes? Is that something that should be tolerated? Because the government can do that. Should individual people be able to do it? Or can you see why there would be a problem there?
So at some point, you are engaged in activities that are such a threat to people around you that they would be unjustified. So an example would be, do I have the right to load a revolver and spin it around and point it at your head and then cock the trigger? Well, no. Do I have the right to own a revolver? Well, yes. At one point, it's me owning a weapon for my self-defense. At another point, it's an actual threat to you. The way that we are able to find this equilibrium is not by entrusting a group of lying mass murderers, theft-funded, called Congress. The ability is for us to judge for ourselves. Now, this sounds sort of chaotic, and how will anyone agree on anything? Well, no one agrees on history, but we have a free market in history, more or less. If there wasn't a state, we'd have a free market. In order for people to recognize something as legitimate history, what you have are competing authorities that are voluntarily funded who generally give us an idea of history. What we have in science is people who engage in hypothesis and experiments and voluntary funding that would give us an understanding of science, just as we would have a voluntarily funded organization who gives us an understanding of natural law and objective morality. For the same reason we understand that 1 + 1 = 2, we would understand that initiating violence against peaceful people is inherently immoral. So to answer your question, sometimes all you're doing is finding an equilibrium. It's not immoral for me to pat you on the back. It is immoral for me to hit you 100,000 times as hard as I possibly can. What is the exact amount of force I have to use at which it's a point of an assault? I don't know. Let's have voluntarily funded competing judges. As bad as those voluntarily competing funded judges can be, they're a hell of a lot better than a coercively funded monopoly that claims a double standard on the right to initiate violence and put people in cages for victimless crimes.
Okay. So there's a few points there. I guess just very, very quickly, though. So you're saying that the individual citizen or the individual person shouldn't be allowed to build up a nuke, right? Like, even if they don't cock the nuke, they shouldn't be allowed to have it, is what you're saying, right?
Yes, and the principled difference between, and this doesn't apply for the individual citizen. This is all people, even if they're in the Department of Energy, Department of Defense, Department of Congress. This would still apply, because something like a nuke, you do not have the ability to discriminate between violence, between people initiating violence and people who are innocent civilians.
So nobody in this society should have a nuke, then, is what you're saying. Is that right?
You would be justified in stopping anyone, anywhere, from advocating arms that do not have the ability to discriminate against peaceful individuals and individuals initiating violence against peaceful people. Yeah.
So this society would not have any nuclear weapons. Okay, just for the record, because a lot of the technologies that the military has now that minimize collateral damage, such as drones and whatnot, which are far less deadly to civilians than carpet bombing, which they used to do back in the day. All this was brought about by huge investment by the government that individual, even billionaires, couldn't have done on their own. And yet the government was able to do it. And now we have a means of going about strikes that are more precise and whatnot, that limit collateral damage. But I additionally wanted to just get to a different point of this, which was that you had mentioned the mercenaries, or you had talked about private enterprise earlier. And so Machiavelli, more than half a millennium ago, wrote about how never trust the mercenaries, always have a national standing army, because in peacetime, the mercenaries will command from you a premium, and in wartime, they'll just take a bid by your enemy and go and work for them, because they offered more money. How would you approach that? Don't you understand that there's a point to patriotism and to a national standing army that's committed to defend one nation, not just beholden to whoever's got the highest contract, the highest bidder? Like, don't you understand that there are some elements of security that can't be privatized, because that in and of itself would induce a security externality against the people?
Yes. So for this example, I only refer to what I said in my opening statement about what makes the state an illegitimate institution. Is it initiates aggression against peaceful people. That is the only thing, or rather, it has the institutionalized recognition of initiating violence against peaceful people. That is the only thing that makes it legitimate. So, in other words, we have constant allegiances to people who don't profit us. We have allegiances to our children, our mothers, our fathers, our churches, our friends, our allies, people who we trade with constantly, people who we just see value in, people we may have a crush on or a desire to be friends with. This desire to be loyal and to have an identity with other human beings is totally in line with the non-aggression principle and the principle of self-ownership, so long as you don't have an external party claiming extra rights that no one in the group has the right to have. Again, if none of us have the right to tax people, then we can't delegate that right to a congressman. We can't delegate the right to kill innocent people to a congressman. The idea that, well, it's going to exist anyways is not legitimate, because then it says, well, it's going to exist anyways, therefore the Catholic Church has the right to do it, and Amazon, and Walmart, and the Red Cross, and Blue Yeti Microphone, and Cox Communications, and Apple has the right to initiate violence because if they didn't do it, someone else would. That is not a general recognition of the conservative principle of a natural order, of a justification based on natural law principles. So, therefore, neoconservatism is in opposition to natural law and the natural order of things, far from it being in opposition to a Hobbesian war of all against all.
Wait, but we don't covenant to allow Amazon the monopoly on the right to the legitimate use of force. We covenant to the state to have the legitimate use of force. There's a difference there. The state is special. We agree in our social contract to have the state, and in this case, an elected representative democracy, to have that use of force. Amazon is different than the U.S. government. They're not morally equal. The U.S. government is an exceptional entity. Additionally, when it comes to all of this, I'm not saying that in a vacuum, for example, this wouldn't be something that you maybe could do. I think that life would really be hurt by doing this, because you'd be stifling, if not rendering totally impossible, any big project innovation such as the internet, satellites, missiles, etc. All that kind of stuff wouldn't really be possible in a voluntarist society. But additionally, when I talk about how it couldn't work because there would be a new state that would emerge from it. I'm not even necessarily implying there that the people of what would become the United States, if we were to go in this direction that you're laying out, would just immediately say, okay, let's go back to what we had before. I'm saying that Russia or China would just come in and now you'd be under a new state. And any state that had the moral depravity to just kill all the men, enslave all the women, would be easily able to take over America if they had nukes and all this kind of stuff, and they had huge tanks and a voluntarist society. They might have some modern equipment right now. Let's fast forward 200 years. Russia and China have been doing big government research projects. They've got the latest weapons and everything. America is still 200 years old because it's good luck funding anything big to keep up when you can't induce taxation or anything. I mean, the idea that taxation is theft is insane to me. I think that taxation is necessary for civilization to and not just exist, but to be good in any way. Life would suck without the pool of the public purse to put towards big projects that are bigger than ourselves. And so I had another sort of question though, which is that getting back to what we were talking about before about, crime and everything, I got two questions. The first is, should police have the right to arrest criminals? And when I say police, I'm not just talking about some private security agency. I mean, the actual police, should they have the right to arrest criminals right now? And second, you mentioned victimless crimes. I've often heard of things like drug crimes as victimless. I've heard of tax fraud or accounting crimes as victimless, but we know that those hurt people. So my question is, first off, should police today have the right to arrest people? And second, what is a victimless crime in your view?
So if someone has a right to do something, what I am talking about is they are morally justified insofar as they do not initiate fraud or violence, violate the consent of a person or their justly acquired property that is done so through voluntary exchange or original appropriation. If you violate the rights of a person, you are an aggressor, therefore you are a criminal, therefore you are justly to be arrested, whether it's by a person with a badge or a person with camouflage or me on my off time. So yes, police would have the right to do something, just as Walmart would, or I would, or you would, or any of the viewers watching would have the right to do something. As far as a victimless crime, if you cannot say that you have violated the rights or a voluntary agreement with a certain person or party of individuals, you have not committed a crime. In order for a crime to exist, there has to be a victim, and the victim has to have their rights violated. It's not enough to hurt someone. My previous employer hurt me when they fired me. My girlfriend hurt me when she broke up with me many years ago. I've gotten over it since then. So don't bug me in the comments about this. Many people, you have offended me in insulting the Branch Davidians, for whom David Thibodeau is a friend of mine. That doesn't give me the right to arrest you. The fact that you have hurt me or negatively affected me does not give you the right to does not give me, rather, the right to arrest you because you have hurt me. What would give me the right is if you initiated violence or fraud against me. The principle between those two things, violence and fraud, is you have violated my consent. So let's say you take this phone, you break into my house, take this phone, and you leave. Well, you have taken a scarce resource that I have justly acquired, and you have taken it. Therefore, I would justly seek restitution against you. That is an example of when I would have the right to take something back from you plus restitution because you have taken a scarce resource from me. Well, what if I said that I will give you this phone and give me $300 within the next month? If 5 months go by and you haven't given me the $500, well, you are in breach of our agreement and you might as well have stolen it from me. Again, fraud and voluntary exchange are perfectly in line with the self-ownership principle and the non-aggression principle. Therefore, they are criminal actions, whereas hurting someone is not in violation. Therefore, you would not have the right to use violence against them. personal story, my father was a crack addict, certainly hurt our family. Honestly, it was terrible. The only thing that would have been worse for our family to suffer was if the police would have jailed him and then brought him into prison, where he would have made friends with other drug dealers and become even more of a criminal, where he would have had an arrest record, which would have hurt his job prospects, which would have stopped him from helping my mom with paying child support. Again, kidnapping people for victimless crimes or crimes that have not violated the rights of other people is unjustified, both on a deontological rights ground, along with a utilitarian mass utility recognition of whether or not society is justified in caging people for victimless crimes.
So just to clarify here, you would say that it's a victimless crime to sell meth or crack or whatever you will to somebody, and then it causes in them an addiction that ruins their lives and ruins their family. You don't think that the family then, even in a stateless society, should have the restitution to either sue in private arbitration or outright get revenge in vigilante form against the drug dealer? You mentioned how you didn't support somebody who became a drug addict being arrested, but would you at least get behind going after the guy that sold your dad those drugs?
No,
Really?
I would not. He
Really?
was engaged.
Like proliferators of drugs are evil. I mean, like hardcore drugs are literal filth. So
not only would you not be justified in caging someone for engaging in a voluntary exchange with someone else in a free society where there is no drug war, you would not even have such potent drugs. So just as during Prohibition, you had things like moonshine, where you had to hide it from the kidnapping cops. So you had to have a small amount that was really potent. Today, there's a drug war, so you have to have a small amount that's really potent. Just as you don't have people drinking moonshine today at bars, you have people drinking beer. You wouldn't have people using crystal meth and crack cocaine. You would have people using some derivative of Adderall to give them their fix today. So, and also pursuing a policy against people like the Al Capones of the world actually makes things more violent. Just as there's no shootout between Miller Lite and Bud Light today, there wouldn't be shootouts between Mexican drug cartels if it weren't for the drug war in the United States. I'm sure it would still exist in Mexico. Mexico's more violent than the U.S. The Mexico government's evil. I have no problem admitting that. But the idea that, well, there's violence and then the government comes in and solves things. The fact that the government intervenes in what would otherwise be a voluntary interaction makes things more violent than they otherwise would be, because they initiate violence into what would otherwise be a voluntary exchange between consenting adults.
Wait, so I just want to get this clear here. So in this example, you're basically saying that, well, it would be better and less toxic and everything if we were in this like a utopian model and everything. The problem that I have, though, is that, okay, let's just talk about from a standpoint of liberty and everything. How you talked about a voluntary trade interaction where you've got a drug addict and you've got the drug seller. I don't consider somebody who's under the influence of drugs, I don't consider their decisions to be voluntary. How is an addict who needs more to get his fix? How is that how are you able to exercise liberty when you're addicted to an evil substance? I don't understand that.
Because you still have an adult brain with a neofrontal cortex that has the ability to weigh costs, benefits, short-term effects, and long-term effects. Maybe they should read Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, so they recognize not only the short-term but the long-term effects, not only on one group but on all groups considered. The fact that there are negative externalities with drug addicts does not justify the existence of one group of people initiating violence against all drug addicts and all drug dealers for all of eternity. This is a voluntary exchange between consenting adults. I don't think you should give up your kidney. If you want to sell your kidney, your body, your choice, your life, your choice, your business, your choice. This is the fundamental difference between the conservative principle that I actually advocate, the principle of civilization, and the leftist principle of collectivism. We, the collective, haven't given you the right to engage in such an activity. That is totally unjustified if we want to embrace the principles of Americanism, the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, the right to abolish government, the right to freedom of speech, and the Second Amendment. We have to recognize people's self-ownership and their ability to live their life however they please, so long as they do not initiate violence or fraud against peaceful individuals.
Okay. So, like my dad was addicted to drugs, for example, ruined my family, all that kind of stuff. I consider those that sold him drugs, that kind of thing, as perpetrators of violence, both against him and my family, for example. You see it as a non-violent, voluntarist, voluntary interaction. I completely disagree with that characterization. I think that one reason why the government exists is to have moral standards for society to keep us from falling into the state of nature, if you will. And that, we can disagree over to the extent of what should be legal, what shouldn't, et cetera, and what's, like a gray area and everything. But that there is a clear case here for this to be seen as a violent sort of act. So this leads me to my next question, and that is, and I guess, I'll say to the moderator, Henry, are you good if we do like a 2-minute intermission? Or what do you guys think?
I was gonna say something. I was gonna say something around the 2-hour mark. Eventually, I figured either you guys want to wrap it up or take a break. I would assume to use the restroom or something. It's up to you guys.
You know what? Could we wrap it up, please? I just have to get a hold of my mom. I also have a number of obligations before the night ends. Could we go 10 more minutes?
Sure.
And then end it? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, no, sure. So I got one last question then that I'll close on, and then you can get a question, and then we can do our closing statements, I guess. So my last question then is going to be, in this society, how would you enforce the age of consent? How would you prevent people, seriously, think about it, because you might have some people out there that don't share your moral compass, that regard being, say, 52 and having sex with a 13-year-old is totally fine, even if you could argue that it violates the NAP, but they say it doesn't, and they claim to be a good anarcho-capitalist or whatever. How would you go about stopping these people, and where's the line, and how would you enforce an age of consent in this system, Keith?
The way to enforce an age of consent can be done 2 ways. 1, by a coercively funded monopoly known as the state, or 2, by voluntarily funded, cooperating, competing institutions. It is superior to have a group of competing, voluntarily funded institutions to enforce a genuine age of consent rather than a coercively funded, involuntary group of people called the state. No, I am not saying that. I know for a fact the age of consent will be justified in the absence of a state, but the existence of a state does not stop people from engaging in violations of consent. The obvious example would be Eli Cohen, the Mossad agent in Syria, who would have literal minors sleep with Syrian officials so he could get information on the Syrian officials, so he could help Israel in the 6-day war. Of course, background about Israel. Israel is the freest nation in the Middle East, and of course I support them. That was simply an example of how the existence of a government does not stop the age of consent from being violated. We're not talking about a utopia, as my opponent, Mr. Castley, mentioned earlier. All I am talking about is I want X achieved. We want something achieved. We can either do it voluntarily or violently. We can either do it through voluntarily funded competition or coercively funded monopoly. My position is superior because it allows people to opt out of associating with evil, and it allows the masses to allocate resources in such a way that they are desirable to make sure the vulnerable are protected, that freedom is achieved, and the principle of self-ownership can be practiced in the real world.
Okay, well, I guess we'll wrap up the debate then. I guess we should probably go to our closing remarks. So.
Yeah, if you want to do I don't know who wants to go first, but I think you guys are okay with like brief closing statements, like 3 minutes or so. Is that maybe 5 minutes? Is that better? Or?
I'm good with 3. Like, because
3?
Keith, you mentioned that we
Okay.
could do shorter ones. Yeah, 3 minutes.
All right. So who went? I guess Kevin, do you want to go first since Keith went first at the beginning, and then Keith gets the last word?
Sure.
All right.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah. So I think it's been clear tonight, my friends. So thank you for tuning in and everything. Thanks to Henry for moderating. Thanks to Keith for coming on. It's always good to see people who, they disagree, but they at least have the courage to come here and debate, because some people out there that are opponents of mine, they just don't have the courage to do it. And, it's always better when we can have an exchange of ideas. And so what I think in terms of my thoughts about everything tonight is I think I've made a fairly clear case why we not only need a state at a domestic level, why it is the case that things tend towards monopoly, and therefore we're best to have a monopoly in which we have a universal covenant towards to have a legitimate sovereign. And I prefer representative democracy there. That's the best system. I think that it's very clear that the state that exists in the United States, for example, as well as all Western nations, is exceptional compared to the continents of slavery that have existed throughout history and exist today. I think I've made a very clear case for government intervention obviously in the market, in society, etc., to protect us, not only from violence from the outside, but also, and many times from ourselves, from doing things that might in the short run seem good, but impose harm not only on ourselves, but on others, and that we need a mechanism there to correct for that behavior. We didn't get to as much of foreign policy as I thought we'd get into, but I think I've also made a fairly clear-cut case as well for interventionism, for preemptive action, for preemptive warfare to minimize casualties in the long run, because we recognize that war between powers is inevitable, and therefore we are better to do it earlier on our terms when our enemy is weaker than wait for them to engage in violence against us later on their terms when they're stronger. It's the difference between maybe 3 million people dying today and 50 million people dying 6 years from now, for example, depending on how fast they are able to amass their arsenals. And so on the domestic level that we were talking about, I think I made a fairly clear-cut case for the state as the compassionate and ultimately necessary force that has the legitimate monopoly on the use of violence, because the externalities that exist necessitate an intervention both abroad and at home. So thank you for watching, and with that, I yield my time.
All right. So if you want to go ahead and close this out, Keith.
Mr. Castley, thank you so much for having me on your program. I greatly appreciate it. I as well appreciate you in the fight against leftism, socialism, communism, and tyranny. I will say that I believe my position is still superior. One, because there are two ways of achieving your ends in society. Whether it's what you want to have for lunch or what you want to be 100 years from now, you can either achieve your ends violently or voluntarily through the political means or the economic means, where you engage in voluntary interaction or you engage in interaction at the expense without the consent of other individuals. The way of the free market, the way of libertarianism, self-ownership, and the non-aggression principle is consistent. It is morally justified. The state is inconsistent and is immorally justified and in opposition to civilization because it claims the right to initiate violence against peaceful people. This claim that some people have the right to rule over others is literally the claim of the slave owner, the right that we own, you people called the citizenry. The group of people called the Congress group own the lives and they own the bodies of the people called the citizenry. Again, on the economic point, a coercively funded monopoly is inferior, both productively and morally, than a competing, voluntarily funded group of competing organizations. So again, every criticism that can apply of voluntarily funded competition applies tenfold to the coercively funded monopoly of the state that Mr. Castley advocates, if we want to embrace the ideas of Thomas Jefferson, all men created equal, endowed by a creator with certain unalienable rights, the right to pursue your life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, without a group of people claiming the right to own your body, then we must embrace the principles of self-ownership, voluntary trade, and the non-aggression principle. Mr. Castley, thank you for your time, and thank you to Henry for moderating the debate, as well as the listeners for taking the time to listen to us. For the same reason we should have separation of church and state, we should have separation of economy and state, and separation of dispute, whether foreign or domestic, and state.
All right, great. Obviously, you guys know this is Kevin's channel, where to find him. I think you can find Keith at, I believe his YouTube channel is Don't Tread on Anyone, if you want to find him. So I guess that wraps it up. Have a great night, guys.
Yeah, I'll be doing a post show too. And Keith gets the right to mirror this over on his channel. And if you want to debate me too out there, just send me a DM on Twitter and we'll work out the time as well so you can debate me like Keith did tonight. So thanks for watching.